At 4 in the morning, a factory tells the truth. There are no meetings at that hour, no polished presentations, no executives rehearsing explanations. There is only fluorescent light, quiet machinery, and the sound of whatever is still working. Jonathan Mercer heard the impossible before he saw it. He had just passed security inside Vanguard Aeronautics in Long Beach when a deep mechanical hum rolled through the production bay. He stopped with one hand still holding his car keys. For 3 days, the most important machine in the building had been silent. A 5-axis CNC system worth more than $2 million had shut down in the middle of a precision run, and every report on Jonathan's desk said the same thing: critical control failure, replacement hardware required, production delay unavoidable. 15 engineers had resigned before midnight, and now the machine was running. Jonathan set his coffee on an empty tool cart and walked faster. The factory looked almost unreal at that hour. Long rows of workstations stretched beneath white lights. Safety rails cast thin shadows across the polished concrete. Computer screens slept behind dark glass. Farther down the bay, the CNC stood inside its guarded cell, its status panel glowing green. A young man was crouched beside it. Grey coveralls, intern badge, sleeves rolled to the elbows. A notebook lay open on the floor beside a row of hand tools arranged with almost obsessive care. The young man's hands were stained with coolant residue and metal dust. He was tightening a panel when Jonathan stepped closer. "Who are you?" The young man turned so quickly that the wrench in his hand clicked against the panel. For 1 second, neither of them spoke. Jonathan recognized fear, but not panic. The young man stood, wiped his palms on a shopcloth and straightened his shoulders. "Gabriel Mendoza, sir." "Gabe, I'm an intern." Jonathan looked at the badge clipped to his chest. Gabriel Mendoza, production support intern. Then he looked past him at the machine. "Who authorized you to work on this?" Gabe swallowed. "No one, sir." The answer should have made Jonathan angry. Under normal circumstances, an unauthorized intern opening a $2 million machine at 4 in the morning would have ended the conversation immediately. But nothing about the morning was normal. Jonathan moved toward the control screen. All 5 axes were reporting nominal. The spindle temperature was stable. The coolant pressure was balanced. The machine had completed a calibration sequence 11 minutes earlier without a single fault. He stared at the display, then at Gabe. "My engineering team told me this system needed a new central controller." "The controller is fine." Jonathan slowly turned. Gabe seemed to realize how bold the sentence sounded. "Sir," he added, quieter, "I think it was fine the whole time." The machine continued humming between them. Jonathan had built Vanguard Aeronautics from a rented industrial unit 38 years earlier. He had spent enough time around machines to know when one was running clean. This one sounded clean. "Show me." Gabe looked toward the notebook on the floor. Before he could pick it up, Jonathan noticed something else. 15 names had disappeared from the engineering shift board mounted outside the bay. Small magnetic tags normally lined the board by team. Tonight an entire column was empty. He already knew why. At 12:18 a.m., the first resignation had arrived in his email. At 12:24, another. By 12:51, there were 8. Before 1 in the morning, 15 engineers from the same division had submitted resignations effective immediately. Jonathan had spent the next hour calling senior managers. He received careful answers and vague phrases, accumulated frustration, leadership disagreement, burnout, breakdown in confidence. No one could explain why all 15 had chosen the same night. That was why he had driven to Long Beach himself. He had expected to find a dead machine and an empty department. Instead, he had found an intern. Gabe bent down and lifted the notebook. The blue cover was worn at the corners. Inside were hand-drawn diagrams of coolant lines, thermal zones, sensor paths, and maintenance dates. Some notes were written in English. In the margins were a few short phrases Jonathan did not recognize. "Tagalog?" Jonathan asked. Gabe nodded. "Sometimes I write reminders the way my grandfather says them." "Your grandfather is an engineer?" "No, sir. He repairs machines in the Philippines." Jonathan looked at him again. That answer opened a door Gabe had not expected to walk through that morning. 6 weeks earlier, Gabriel Mendoza had entered Vanguard Aeronautics through the same security gate with a borrowed tie, a new pair of work shoes, and the belief that if he worked hard enough, somebody would eventually notice. He was 20 years old, studying mechanical engineering at a community college in Southern California. He had been born in Quezon City and spent much of his childhood between the capital and Olongapo, where his grandfather Ernesto kept a small repair shop behind a hardware store. When Gabe was 14, his mother, Lisa, brought him and his younger sister to California. Liza worked long hospital shifts and built their new life one careful month at a time. Gabe learned English quickly, learned the bus routes, learned which grocery store discounted rice on Wednesdays, and learned how strange it felt to miss a place while trying to belong to another. What he never lost was the habit his grandfather had given him. Listen first. Whenever a machine failed in Ernesto's shop, Gabe had wanted to grab tools immediately. His grandfather would stop him. No, first listen. A pump could complain through vibration. A motor could reveal imbalance through heat. A bearing could announce trouble with a change in rhythm long before a warning light appeared. A machine does not know how to lie, Ernesto liked to say, but people can ask it the wrong question. Gabe carried that sentence with him across the Pacific. At Vanguard, however, no one had hired him to diagnose anything. His internship description was painfully ordinary: inventory support, tool control, documentation, supply coordination. He accepted every task without complaint. On his first day, Douglas Crane, the vice president of engineering operations, glanced at Gabe's resume for less than 10 seconds. Community college? Yes, sir. First-year student? Second year. Douglas handed the resume back. Good. Then you know enough to stay out of the way. Gabe had smiled because he thought it was a joke. Douglas did not smile back. Still, Gabe refused to become bitter. He organized tools, delivered paperwork, tracked calibration equipment, and watched everything. During lunch breaks, he studied machine manuals. During bus rides home, he copied diagrams into his blue notebook. At night, after dinner with his mother and sister, he called Lolo Ernesto in the Philippines and asked questions about pumps, heat transfer, and vibration. He did not know that 6 weeks after his first day, those quiet habits would place him alone beside the most expensive broken machine in the building. He did not know 15 engineers would walk away, and he certainly did not know that, at 4 in the morning, the billionaire who owned the company would stand in front of him and say 2 words that could change his entire future. Show me. 6 weeks before the night everything changed, Gabe's world at Vanguard was measured in small permissions. He was allowed into the tool room, but not the engineering lab. He could deliver calibration equipment but not operate it. He could stand near production meetings if he had paperwork to distribute, but he was expected to leave before technical discussion began. At first, none of this bothered him. He understood hierarchy, he understood safety. He also understood that a 20-year-old student should not expect a company that built aerospace components to treat him like a senior engineer after 1 semester of thermodynamics. So he watched. Vanguard Aeronautics occupied nearly half a mile of industrial property near the port of Long Beach. Freight traffic moved beyond the outer fence from dawn until well after midnight. Inside the plant, precision ruled everything. Temperature-controlled machining rooms held equipment that could shape nickel alloys and titanium within microscopic tolerances. Finished components passed through laser inspection before leaving the floor. Gabe loved the place immediately. Not because it was glamorous, it was not. The air carried the faint smell of coolant and warm metal. Forklifts beeped constantly. Employees wore hearing protection in marked zones. Most walls were practical shades of grey. But everything had a purpose. He liked purpose. At home, Liza noticed the change first. "You talk about that factory more than your classes," she said one evening while packing leftovers into containers. Gabe laughed. "The factory makes the classes make sense." His younger sister Mara looked up from the kitchen table. "Do they let you build airplanes yet?" "Mostly I build shelves full of correctly labeled torque wrenches. Very heroic. You'd be surprised. Civilization depends on labels." Liza smiled but studied her son for another second. "Are they treating you well?" The question was simple, Gabe answered carefully. I'm learning a lot. It was true, even if it was not the whole truth. Douglas Crane ran engineering operations like a man trying to keep a complicated machine from shaking apart. He was not cruel. He did not insult people for entertainment. In fact, he rarely raised his voice. His problem was certainty. Douglas believed every technical organization needed a single direction, and he believed that direction should usually come from him. Meetings moved quickly because disagreement did not last long. Younger engineers learned to present conclusions, not doubts. Questions that challenged an established plan were often redirected into private follow-ups that never happened. The result looked efficient from a distance. Up close, it felt narrow. Gabe first noticed this during a routine maintenance review. He had entered the room only to drop off printed inspection sheets. On the screen, an engineer named Priya Shah was showing temperature data from a milling cell. One sensor had shown a repeating rise at the end of long production cycles. It's still inside operating range, Douglas said. Yes, Priya replied, but the slope changed after the service interval. I think we should compare the coolant flow directly. The pressure is normal. Pressure can be normal while flow is restricted. Douglas leaned back. Do we have a fault? No. Do we have failed parts? No. Then document the trend and move on. Priya closed her mouth. Gabe had already reached the door, but the exchange stayed with him. Pressure can be normal while flow is restricted. That evening he wrote the sentence in his notebook. He did not know why. Several days later, he met Marcus Reed, a manufacturing engineer in his early 30s, who seemed to possess the rare ability to be busy without looking angry. Marcus found Gabe standing beside an inactive machining cell during lunch, reading a maintenance manual. You know that's terrible lunch entertainment, right? Gabe looked up. Depends on the lunch. Marcus glanced at the page. Thermal compensation system? I'm trying to understand why the machine corrects position based on spindle temperature. Because metal grows when it gets hot. I know that part. I mean how the controller predicts the growth. Marcus studied him, then pulled a chair over. For the next 15 minutes, he explained thermal drift, coolant stability, sensor placement, and why precision machines could be mechanically healthy but dimensionally wrong if heat was not controlled. Gabe listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, Gabe asked, So, a temperature problem can look like a position problem? Absolutely. Sometimes it can even look electronic. That's what makes these systems fun. Fun? I have made questionable career choices. Gabe smiled. That brief conversation became important because Marcus was one of the first employees at Vanguard who treated Gabe's curiosity as useful rather than inconvenient. It also became important because Marcus would later be one of the 15 engineers who resigned. For now, however, the factory continued normally. Gabe learned the rhythms of the shifts. He learned which operators preferred paper checklists and which relied entirely on tablets. He learned that the night maintenance crew kept better handwritten notes than the official database. He learned that machines often developed personalities in the way workers talked about them. The 5-axis CNC in Cell 7 was called Elena by the operators. No one remembered who had started it. Elena was the most expensive production machine on the floor, a towering enclosed system built to manufacture complex turbine components. Its spindle could rotate faster than most car engines. Its rotary tables could reposition a part while cutting, allowing intricate shapes to be machined without removal. Gabe was fascinated by it. He never touched the controls. He did, however, know its sounds. When he passed Cell 7, he could tell whether it was cutting, calibrating, or idling from the pitch alone. One afternoon, while delivering a set of gauges, he heard something different. Not dramatic, not a grind or a bang, just a slight change in the cooling system's rhythm near the end of a long machining cycle. Gabe slowed. The operator, Denise Keller, looked over. Something wrong? I don't know. Does the coolant pump always sound like that? Denise listened. Like what? Gabe almost laughed at himself. The sound was subtle enough that he could not explain it without sounding foolish. Nothing. Sorry. He continued walking. But that night he called Ernesto. The video connection froze twice before his grandfather's face appeared on the screen. Behind him were shelves of old tools and the familiar green metal fan that had been in the Olongapo shop for as long as Gabe could remember. "Lolo, can a pump keep normal pressure if the flow is getting worse?" Ernesto squinted. "Of course. Depends where pressure is measured." "Why?" "Just something at work." "You touched it?" "I'm not allowed." Ernesto smiled. "Good. Then don't touch it." Gabe frowned. "That's your advice?" "You are an intern. Learn first. Permission matters." That answer surprised him. Ernesto had always taught him confidence around machines, but never recklessness. Then the old man added, "But write down what you noticed." Gabe opened the blue notebook. On a fresh page, he wrote the date. Cell 7. Late cycle coolant sound slightly uneven. No visible fault. Pressure reportedly normal. Underneath, in smaller letters, he wrote another sentence. Listen before the alarm starts. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon at 2:17, Elena stopped in the middle of a production cycle. The spindle froze. The control panel flashed red. And the first error code appeared. The first alarm lasted 12 seconds. That was long enough to change the mood of an entire building. Gabe was in the tool room when the production. Radio crackled with an urgent request for engineering support in Cell 7. He looked up from the inventory scanner. Across the aisle, 2 technicians were already moving toward the door. By the time Gabe reached the production bay with a requested diagnostic kit, 6 engineers surrounded the CNC. Elena was silent. A partially machined turbine component remained locked inside the work chamber. Red warning text filled the control display. The main fault indicated an axis positioning inconsistency. Beneath it were secondary alerts involving temperature compensation and spindle feedback. Douglas Crane arrived within minutes. "Nobody resets anything until we capture the full log," he said. His voice immediately organized the room. Priya downloaded the diagnostic history. Marcus checked the servo data. Another engineer inspected the control cabinet. Denise, the operator, explained that the machine had shown no obvious warning before stopping. Gabe stood outside the marked boundary holding the tool case. For almost an hour, he watched the team work. The controller reported inconsistent position values after the spindle reached a certain operating temperature. The servo system itself tested normally. The encoder feedback appeared valid during low-speed checks. Cooling pressure remained within specification. Douglas focused on the central controller. "The compensation table is probably corrupt," he said. Marcus looked unconvinced. "Could be, but the temperature alert came first in the event sequence. By less than a second. Still came first." Douglas pointed toward the screen. "The controller is calculating position from that temperature input. Bad compensation data would create both faults." Priya glanced at the trends. "We should measure actual flow through the spindle loop." Douglas exhaled through his nose. "Pressure is normal." Gabe felt something tighten in his attention. Pressure can be normal while flow is restricted. He remembered Priya saying those words weeks earlier. She remembered too. Gabe could see it in her expression. "I know," she said. "That's why I said flow." Douglas looked around the bay. Production managers were gathering. A scheduler stood near the door with a tablet. The plant manager had just arrived. "Fine," Douglas said. "Check it after the controller diagnostics." That order shaped the next 72 hours. The first night, engineering ran software checks. They compared compensation tables against backups, verified firmware, inspected communications, and restarted the system under controlled conditions. The machine failed again. On Wednesday morning, the engineering team replaced 2 sensor modules. The machine failed again. By Wednesday afternoon, they bypassed a secondary monitoring channel and ran an unloaded calibration sequence. For 23 minutes, everything worked. Then the spindle warmed. The position error returned. Gabe spent the day moving tools between teams and listening. He did not offer an opinion. That evening, however, he stayed late to help reorganize the diagnostic equipment. Marcus was sitting on a rolling chair staring at a laptop when Gabe passed. "Long day?" Gabe asked. Marcus rubbed his eyes. Very long machine, Gabe hesitated. Can I ask something? You usually do. Did anyone check the actual coolant flow? Marcus looked toward the CNC. Not directly. Why not? Because we have pressure, stable reservoir level, and no pump fault. Gabe said nothing. Marcus noticed. You disagree? I don't know enough to disagree. That was a very diplomatic sentence. Gabe smiled faintly. My grandfather says pressure only tells you pressure where you're measuring it. Marcus leaned back. Your grandfather has opinions. Many. He's not wrong. Marcus opened a maintenance diagram on the laptop. He traced the spindle cooling loop with his finger. The problem is access. Direct flow measurement means opening the secondary loop and taking the machine offline longer. Douglas wants proof the controller isn't bad first. Could heat make the position drift? Yes, but the sensors would normally catch it. Normally. Marcus looked at Gabe. For a moment, the intern and the engineer simply stared at the diagram. Then Marcus closed the laptop. Go home. You're hourly. If payroll sees you here this late, they'll blame me. Gabe left, but his mind remained in cell 7. At home, he ate reheated chicken adobo at the kitchen counter while reading photographs he had taken of the public maintenance schedule posted near the tool room. He did not have access to restricted engineering files, but routine service records were visible to production support because interns helped archive them. 8 months earlier, Cell 7 had undergone preventive coolant maintenance. A valve assembly had been replaced. Gabe opened his notebook. He drew the cooling loop from memory. Reservoir, pump, filter, pressure sensor, spindle jacket, return line, heat exchanger. Then he circled the replacement valve. The next morning, the atmosphere at Vanguard had changed. The machine had now been down for almost 20 hours. Production planners were moving jobs to less efficient equipment, but some components could not be transferred. A delivery schedule was already slipping. Jonathan Mercer was at Vanguard's headquarters in Irvine when the first major loss estimate reached him. By Thursday afternoon, Cell 7 had become the center of the company. External support from the machine manufacturer joined by video. Specialists reviewed logs and agreed the controller was the most likely culprit. Replacement options were discussed. The fastest factory-certified unit would take weeks to configure and ship. Douglas became more certain as the pressure increased. We're not going to chase every theoretical possibility, he told the team. We need a decision. Priya spoke carefully. I still want a direct flow reading, and I still want the controller isolated first. We have isolated it 3 different ways. Then do it a 4th. The room went quiet. Gabe stood near the doorway carrying printed reports. Douglas noticed him. Why are you still here? I was asked to bring these. Then bring them and go. Gabe placed the reports on the table. As he turned, one page on the screen caught his eye. Temperature deviation 4.8 degrees Celsius above historical average. He stopped. Sir? Douglas continued reading. Gabe knew he should leave. Instead, he said, the temperature change started before the position faults. Every person at the table looked toward him. Douglas raised his eyes. What? Gabe's mouth went dry. The trend. The spindle temperature is higher than the historical baseline. I was wondering if the controller could be reacting correctly to a mechanical temperature problem. No one laughed. That almost made it worse. Douglas stared at Gabe for several seconds. You were wondering? Yes, sir. Based on what? Gabe thought of the uneven pump sound. Priya's earlier comment, the replaced valve, his grandfather's rule. The coolant loop. Douglas folded his arms. 15 engineers are working this problem. The machine manufacturer is working this problem. You have been here 6 weeks. Gabe nodded. I understand. Do you? Douglas's tone remained controlled, but every word closed another door. Because curiosity is useful. Interruption is not. Gabe felt heat rise into his face. Marcus looked down at the table. Priya's expression tightened. Douglas pointed toward the reports. You did your job. Thank you. Gabe left. He did not slam the door. He did not argue. He did not mutter anything under his breath. He walked back to the tool room, finished his shift and checked every returned instrument into inventory. Only when he was alone on the bus home did he open the blue notebook. For several minutes, he stared at the cooling loop diagram. Then he wrote one sentence beneath it. Maybe being right is not the same as being ready to be heard. He closed the notebook. The next day would prove that the machine was no longer Vanguard's only problem. By Friday morning, exhaustion had become part of the engineering department's language. People stopped asking how anyone was doing because the answer was visible. Coffee cups multiplied beside laptops. Shirts that had been crisp 2 days earlier were wrinkled. Conversations became shorter. Small mistakes appeared in notes and had to be corrected. The machine remained down. Douglas ordered another complete controller test before noon. It passed. Then the CNC failed during thermal calibration again. The failure was now so predictable that Priya could point to the exact minute when the temperature curve would rise and the position data would begin to drift. "This is not random," she said. Marcus nodded. "I agree." Douglas stood behind them with both hands on the conference table. The manufacturer still believes the controller is failing under thermal load. "Because that's the data we're sending them," Priya replied. Douglas's eyes narrowed slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means we keep testing the same theory." A silence followed. Not an explosive silence. Something more tired. Gabe was not in the room this time. After the previous day's exchange, he had made a deliberate decision to stay away from technical meetings unless someone specifically asked him to enter. He spent the morning in receiving, verifying a shipment of cutting tools. At 11:20, Marcus appeared beside him. "Do you still have that notebook?" Gabe looked up. "Yes. Show me the cooling diagram." They moved to a small break table near the loading dock. Gabe opened to the page he had drawn at home. Marcus studied it. "Where did you get the valve replacement date?" "Routine maintenance archive. It's not restricted." "And the sound note?" "I heard the coolant system change near the end of a cycle about 3 weeks ago." "You wrote that down?" "Lolo makes me write everything down." Marcus almost smiled. Then he became serious. "Priya wants to open the loop this afternoon. Douglas won't approve it until after the purchasing call." "What purchasing call?" "Replacement controller. $98,000 before expedited configuration." Gabe stared at him. "They're ordering it." "Probably. Without checking flow?" Marcus closed the notebook carefully. "Gabe, technical organizations don't always fail because nobody sees the answer. Sometimes they fail because nobody can change the question." The sentence stayed with him. At 1 p.m., Jonathan Mercer joined an executive call from Irvine. Douglas presented the recommendation: authorize the replacement controller, shift production, accept the delay and continue secondary diagnostics while waiting. Jonathan asked whether the team was certain. Douglas said, "As certain as we can be without replacing the unit." That answer was enough for finance to prepare the purchase order. It was not enough for the engineers on the floor. The conflict did not begin with shouting. It began with a document. Douglas asked the 15 engineers assigned to the failure to sign an internal technical conclusion stating that the central controller was the confirmed root cause. Priya read the wording twice. "Confirmed?" "Yes," Douglas said. "We haven't confirmed." "We have exhausted reasonable alternatives." Marcus shook his head. "That's not the same thing." Douglas remained calm. "The company needs a formal conclusion to proceed." "Then write most probable cause," Priya said. "Don't write confirmed." Douglas looked around the table. "We are not going to create uncertainty in an executive report because some of you are uncomfortable making a decision." That sentence changed the room. For months, perhaps years, frustrations had accumulated in small layers. Engineers had watched concerns delayed because they contradicted schedules. They had learned to soften questions. They had accepted long hours during difficult launches because aerospace work sometimes demanded them. But this was different. Douglas was asking them to put their names beneath certainty they did not possess. Marcus pushed the document back across the table. "I won't sign that wording." Priya did the same. Another engineer, Elena Torres, folded her arms. "Neither will I." Douglas looked from face to face. "Then we're going to stay here until we have alignment." It was just after 3 in the afternoon. They stayed. At 5, nothing had changed. At 7, the conversation had expanded beyond the CNC. Engineers began mentioning previous occasions when concerns had been minimized, not catastrophes, not scandals, smaller moments. A test repeated because the first result was inconvenient. A maintenance warning postponed because the schedule was tight. A junior engineer told to revise a presentation until it supported the preferred recommendation. Douglas defended each decision individually. That was part of the problem. He could explain every tree and still could not see the forest. At 8:15, Gabe walked past the conference room on his way to return a calibration case. The door was open. He saw 15 exhausted engineers around the table, and Douglas standing at the front. Marcus noticed him but said nothing. Gabe continued walking. 20 minutes later, Priya entered the tool room. "Can I borrow your notebook?" Gabe hesitated. "Why?" "I want to show them the maintenance date and your temperature notes." Gabe handed it over. "You should be the one to explain it," Priya said. His first instinct was yes. His second was the memory of Douglas staring at him the day before. "No," Gabe said. "You understand the system better." Priya studied him. "Are you afraid?" Gabe considered, pretending he was not. "A little." "That's reasonable." She took the notebook. "But your idea deserves a fair test." 10 minutes later, Priya placed the notebook on the conference table. Douglas recognized it immediately. "We're using intern notes now?" "We're using observations," Priya said. "The source doesn't change the data." She explained the coolant hypothesis again. This time Marcus supported her with the historical temperature trend. 2 other engineers agreed that a direct flow test could be completed in less than 2 hours. Douglas refused. The replacement controller order had already been approved in principle. He believed opening the cooling loop would delay the next diagnostic run and introduce another variable. "We're done changing direction," he said. Priya slowly leaned back. "Then I'm done signing my name to this." Douglas stared at her. She opened her laptop. At 9:07 p.m., Priya Shah submitted her resignation. Marcus followed 12 minutes later, then Eleanor, then another engineer. The resignations were not coordinated in advance. That was what made them so alarming. Each person reached the same point independently and decided that staying would require accepting a professional culture they no longer trusted. By 10:30, 9 engineers had resigned. Douglas called human resources. By 11:15, there were 13. The final 2 arrived shortly before midnight. 15 engineers, an entire failure response team. Gabe learned what happened from Marcus near the employee exit. "You're really leaving?" Gabe asked. Marcus held his backpack over one shoulder. "For tonight, yes, tomorrow, I don't know." "But the machine—" Marcus gave a tired smile. "A machine can be repaired. A team has to decide it wants to be repaired." He looked at Gabe's blue notebook, now back in Gabe's hands. "Keep asking the right question. Just be smarter than we were about when and how you ask it." Then he walked out. Gabe stood alone beneath the parking lot lights. His shift was over. His responsibility was over. The reasonable thing was to go home. Instead, he looked back through the glass doors toward the dark production bay. Somewhere inside, Elena sat silent, and in Gabe's notebook, one unchecked possibility was waiting. Gabe rode the bus home with the blue notebook closed in his lap. Liza looked at Gabe's face and did not ask how work had gone. She asked, "What happened?" Gabe placed his backpack on the floor. 15 engineers quit. Liza blinked. "Tonight?" "Tonight." He sat across from her and explained the machine, the controller diagnosis, the cooling theory, the unsigned report, and the meeting that had finally broken the team apart. When Gabe finished, she asked, "What are you thinking about doing?" He looked toward the notebook. "I want to go back. Your shift is over." "I know." "Are you authorized to work on that machine?" "No." The answer sounded worse in the quiet kitchen. Liza folded her hands. "Then why would you go?" "Back?" Gabe searched for a responsible explanation and found only an honest one. "Because I think I know where the problem is." "Thinking you know is not permission," he nodded. Lolo said the same thing. That made her smile slightly. "Your grandfather occasionally has sense." Gabe looked down. "If I do nothing and they're right about the controller, nothing changes. If I do nothing and I'm right, The company waits weeks for a part it doesn't need. And if you touch a machine you are not authorized to touch and something goes wrong? He had no answer. Liza reached across the table and tapped the notebook with one finger. You have spent your whole life learning how to fix things. You also have to learn when fixing something belongs to you. Gabe leaned back. For several minutes neither spoke. Then Liza asked, "Is there any test you can perform without running production?" He looked at her. "A diagnostic flow check, maybe thermal inspection." "Would that change the machine?" "Not if I only inspect." "Then inspect first. Decide after you know more." Gabe called Ernesto in the Philippines. Because of the time difference, morning sunlight was already entering the old repair shop in Olongapo. Ernesto answered with a wrench in one hand. "You look tired," he said. "I am." Gabe explained the situation again. This time focusing on the technical details, Ernesto listened. Pressure sensor location. Before the spindle loop. Return temperature. Higher than historical by almost 5 degrees. Pump current? Normal. Valve changed when? 8 months ago. Ernesto nodded slowly. Could be restriction. Could be something else. That's what I think. No. Gabe frowned. No. You think restriction. That is dangerous. Go there thinking nothing. Measure. Gabe smiled despite himself. You always do that. Because you always want to fall in love with your first idea. Machines punish romance. Ernesto set the wrench down. And Gabe. Yes? Do not prove Douglas wrong. Prove the machine right. Those are different goals. That sentence settled something inside him. At 1:48 a.m., Gabe left the apartment. He returned to Vanguard shortly after 2:30. The security desk knew him. Interns sometimes arrived early for inventory preparation, and his badge still worked. Gabe did not lie when the guard asked why he was there. "I need to document equipment status before morning shift." That was true, although incomplete. Inside, the factory seemed larger without people. Gabe entered Cell 7 and stood in front of the silent CNC. For the first time since the failure, no engineers surrounded it. No laptops, no arguments. No instructions, just the machine. He placed his notebook on the workbench. Then he did what Ernesto had told him. He assumed nothing. First, he reviewed the diagnostic logs available at the local terminal. The pattern was consistent. Normal startup, increasing spindle temperature, gradual positional correction, then mismatch beyond tolerance. Second, he checked external coolant lines with a contact thermometer from the maintenance cabinet. The supply side warmed steadily. The return side was significantly hotter than expected. Third, he listened. With only auxiliary systems powered, the coolant pump produced a faint pulsing sound every few seconds. Gabe placed 2 fingers against the return line. The vibration was weaker there. Restriction, maybe. He did not celebrate. He opened the approved maintenance manual and followed the inspection procedure for the secondary cooling loop. The valve replaced 8 months earlier sat behind a removable service cover near the lower spindle assembly. Gabe stopped before removing it. This was the line his mother had described. Inspect first. He found a transparent sight section farther downstream, something he had overlooked in the diagram. Under auxiliary circulation, flow should have been visibly steady. It was not. Coolant moved through the section in uneven surges. Now he had evidence. Gabe photographed the sight section with a company tablet and recorded the time. Then he checked the maintenance database for the valve part number. The original specification ended in 74B. The replacement installed 8 months earlier ended in 74D. Approved substitute, the record said. Gabe searched the public component manual stored on the maintenance terminal. Both valves shared the same external dimensions and pressure rating, but internally they were not identical. The D model used a narrower metering passage designed for a different coolant viscosity. For 8 months, the system had operated close enough to normal that no alarm appeared. Over time, microscopic metallic residue from routine machining had accumulated around that narrower passage. The flow had slowly fallen. Pressure remained normal because the sensor sat upstream. The spindle ran hotter, Metal expanded. Position drift appeared. The controller compensated until it reached its limit and shut the machine down. Gabe stared at the manual. The controller was not broken. It was protecting the machine. He checked his watch. 3:06 a.m. He could stop there. He had enough evidence to show someone in the morning. Then he remembered the resignation emails, the replacement controller already being purchased, and the production schedule sliding farther behind every hour. He also remembered Ernesto's warning. Do not prove Douglas wrong. Prove the machine right. Gabe opened the service procedure. There was an approved method for isolating the valve without disturbing machine alignment. It required no production operation and could be reversed completely. He read the procedure twice. Then he started. Slowly. Every removed fastener went into a labeled tray. Every step went into the notebook. He isolated the loop, removed the valve insert, and found exactly what the flow pattern had predicted. A ring of fine metallic residue restricting the narrow internal passage. Gabe cleaned the component according to the maintenance instructions, but he still had a problem. The installed valve was the wrong variant for long-term operation. Cleaning it might restore flow temporarily, but the restriction could return. He searched the spare inventory. No 74B valve was available. Then he remembered an older training rig in the decommissioned equipment area. Its coolant system used the same valve family. At 3:28, Gabe found the compatible internal spacer he needed and documented a reversible temporary repair. By 3:46, the coolant loop was reassembled. Flow through the sight section became smooth. Return temperature began falling. Gabe powered the machine into calibration mode. No fault. He ran the thermal test. Still no fault. The spindle reached operating temperature. Position values remained stable. At 3:58, the machine completed its full diagnostic cycle and displayed a green message. Ready for production. Gabe did not cheer. He simply sat on a stool and stared at the screen. 2 minutes later, footsteps entered the bay. A man in a dark jacket stopped behind him. Who are you? Gabe turned, and the story caught up to 4 in the morning. Gabe had imagined being caught a dozen different ways on the bus ride back to Vanguard. In none of those versions was the person standing behind him Jonathan Mercer. For half a second, the name did not register. Then Gabe noticed the silver V-shaped pin from company photographs. The founder, the owner, the man whose signature was on his internship letter. Gabe stood so quickly that the stool rolled backward and bumped the tool cabinet. Mr. Mercer, sir? Jonathan glanced at the machine, then at the open service panel, then at Gabe's hands. I asked who you are, not who I am. There was no anger in his voice, which somehow made Gabe more nervous. Gabriel Mendoza, production support intern. And nobody authorized you to work on this machine. No, sir, yet it's running. Gabe looked at the green status line. Yes, sir. Jonathan stepped closer to the console. He had spent too many years around manufacturing equipment to be impressed by a green screen alone. He opened the diagnostic summary, reviewed the spindle temperature, axis compensation values, coolant pressure, and alarm history. Then he started another calibration cycle himself. The machine moved through its sequence with controlled precision. Jonathan watched without speaking. When the cycle finished, the screen remained green. Start at the beginning, he said. Gabe opened the blue notebook. He did not try to make himself sound clever. He described what he had observed during the previous 3 days. The fault arriving only after heat accumulated, the historical return temperature difference, the replacement valve installed 8 months earlier, and the fact that the pressure sensor sat upstream of the restricted point. Jonathan interrupted only once. You found this in the maintenance database? The valve change, yes. The temperature pattern was in the machine logs. And my engineering team didn't see it? Gabe hesitated. They were looking at the controller because the controller alarm was where the failure appeared. Jonathan studied him. It would have been satisfying to say they were wrong, but Ernesto's voice returned with perfect clarity. Do not prove Douglas wrong. Prove the machine right. The controller wasn't lying, Gabe continued. It was protecting the spindle. The cooling restriction caused enough thermal growth for the position corrections to exceed tolerance. The controller shut the system down because it was doing its job. Jonathan looked toward the service panel. Show me the restriction. Gabe powered down the appropriate auxiliary circuit and followed the isolation sequence. He showed Jonathan the valve insert he had cleaned and the photographs of the residue before removal. He showed the component specifications for the 74B and 74D variants. Same pressure rating, Jonathan murmured. Different metering passage. How did the wrong one get approved? I don't know. That answer mattered. Jonathan had spent decades around people who filled silence with certainty. Gabe did the opposite. When he knew, he explained. When he did not, he stopped. And this, Jonathan asked, pointing to the temporary spacer, compatible part from a decommissioned training rig. I documented where it came from. It's reversible. I wouldn't run production on it without engineering approval. Jonathan's eyes lifted from the component. You repaired the machine, but you won't run it? I proved the fault and restored the cooling loop. That's not the same as approving it for production. For the first time, Jonathan's expression changed. Not a smile, exactly. Something closer to recognition. Good answer. Those two words hit Gabe harder than he expected. Jonathan picked up the notebook and turned several pages. The handwriting was small and precise. Beside the technical drawings were dates, temperatures, part numbers, and questions surrounded by boxes. On one page, Jonathan saw a short Tagalog sentence. What does this mean? Gabe looked. Makinig muna. It means listen first. Your grandfather again? Yes, sir. Tell me about him. The question surprised Gabe more than anything else that morning. So he told Jonathan about Ernesto's little repair shop near Olongapo, about motors opened on wooden benches, about old pumps that came back to life because his grandfather noticed a vibration other people ignored. He explained that Ernesto had never called what he did engineering. He simply repaired what people brought him. Jonathan listened with both hands resting on the workbench. I started Vanguard in a rented unit with 2 machines that were older than you are now, he said. Back then, if something stopped, there was nobody to call. You learned or you closed? Gabe nodded. Lolo would like that. Would he like you opening a $2 million machine without authorization? Gabe's stomach tightened. No, sir. Jonathan waited. He'd probably tell me skill doesn't excuse judgment. Would he be right? Yes. Jonathan closed the notebook and handed it back. Then remember that. You may have saved us from replacing a controller we didn't need. You also crossed an authorization line that exists for a reason. Both things can be true at once. Gabe felt his face warm. I understand. Do you? I think so. Good. Thinking is better than pretending. Jonathan turned toward the engineering shift board. 15 missing magnetic nameplates left pale rectangles where dust had not settled. Now tell me why my engineers resigned. Gabe became very still. I don't know everything. Tell me what you do know. This felt more dangerous than discussing the machine. Gabe explained the emergency meeting. Douglas's insistence that the team sign the controller diagnosis, the exhaustion in the room, and the moment one engineer had refused. He described the resignations carefully, avoiding exaggeration and refusing to guess at motives he had not heard directly. Jonathan asked, Were you in that meeting? Only because I was delivering calibration reports. Did you speak? Gabe looked at the notebook. Yes. What happened? He could still hear Douglas telling him that 15 engineers had nearly 200 years of combined experience. Mr. Crane said I should stay with the work I was assigned. Jonathan's jaw shifted almost imperceptibly. Anything else? Gabe paused. He was under a lot of pressure. Everybody was. Jonathan's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in thought. You're protecting him. No, sir. I'm trying not to describe what I can't know. Again, that small look of recognition. Jonathan checked his watch. 4:32 a.m. Do not touch anything else. Leave the machine exactly as it is. Gabe nodded immediately. Jonathan pulled out his phone. I'm calling the plant manager, quality director, and maintenance lead. At 6, they will independently verify your diagnosis. At 7, I want every document related to that valve replacement. At 8:30, I want a room prepared for the 15 engineers who resigned. Gabe blinked. They resigned, sir. I know. What if they don't come? Jonathan looked at the empty shift board. Then I will have learned something else about my company. He began walking away, then stopped. Gabe. Sir? Go wash your hands. Gabe looked down at the coolant stains and metal dust. Am I fired? Jonathan considered the question for a moment. At 4:30 in the morning, I have one machine that works, 15 engineers who don't, and an intern who has given me more useful information in 20 minutes than I received in 3 days. He picked up his coffee from the tool cart. I haven't decided anything yet. Then he walked toward the executive stairs. Gabe remained beside the machine, relief and fear arriving at the same time. On the screen, the words, "Ready for production," still glowed green. But Gabe understood now that Elena had been the easiest thing in the building to repair. At 5:07 a.m., Jonathan Mercer called the first engineer who had resigned. Marcus Lee answered on the fourth ring. Mr. Mercer, I know what time it is. I apologize. There was a tired pause. Is this about my resignation? Yes, but I'm not calling to argue with it. I'm asking you to come back to the plant at 8:30 for one conversation. You will remain resigned unless you decide otherwise. No pressure, no paperwork, no speeches. Marcus said nothing. Jonathan added, The machine is running. That changed the silence. What? The CNC is running. The controller arrived? No. Jonathan looked through the glass wall of his second-floor office toward cell 7. Gabriel Mendoza found a cooling restriction connected to the replacement valve from last winter. Marcus exhaled slowly. The intern. The intern. Another pause. Then Marcus said, I'll come. Jonathan made 14 more calls. Some engineers answered immediately. Others let the phone ring. One sent a text asking whether Douglas Crane would be present. Jonathan replied that he would, but that Douglas would not control the meeting. By 6 a.m., 11 engineers had agreed to return temporarily. By 6:20, the last 2 did not respond. Jonathan did not call again. Meanwhile, an independent verification team gathered around the CNC. Priya Shah, Vanguard's quality director, arrived in running shoes beneath her work trousers, because Jonathan had called while she was leaving for an early morning walk. Maintenance supervisor Tom Alvarez arrived 10 minutes later, hair still damp from the shower. Plant manager Rebecca Collins came carrying 2 folders and a phone filled with unanswered messages. Gabe stood several feet away. For the first time all night, he had nothing to do. Priya reviewed his notebook without knowing which conclusions were his. Jonathan had deliberately asked her to treat it as an anonymous diagnostic record. She checked the thermal logs. Tom inspected the valve. Rebecca reviewed the maintenance history. Then they repeated Gabe's test sequence from the beginning. At 6:48, Priya removed her safety glasses. The diagnosis is sound. Jonathan did not react. Completely? The root cause is insufficient coolant flow through the secondary spindle loop. The controller shutdown was protective. The temporary configuration restored flow, but we need formal engineering review before production release. Tom held up the 74D valve insert. And this should never have been installed here. Rebecca frowned. The system says approved substitute. The system is wrong. Jonathan's eyes moved to her. Rebecca corrected herself. The substitution record is wrong. The software only reflects what someone entered. That distinction sounded familiar. A machine does not know how to lie. People can ask it the wrong question. Jonathan looked through the glass toward Gabe. Find out who approved it. Rebecca nodded. And Jonathan, Priya said. The intern did something else right. He didn't attempt a production cycle. He stopped at diagnostic validation. He also accessed equipment without authorization. Yes. I don't want us turning recklessness into a heroic company story because the result happened to be good. Priya smiled slightly. That's why you're saying it to me. Instead of putting his picture on the lobby screen. Jonathan almost smiled back. I haven't had enough coffee for a lobby screen. Across the floor, Gabe sat in the break room with a paper cup of water. He had washed his hands twice, but grey traces remained around his fingernails. He texted his mother. Found the problem. Machine passed diagnostics. Owner showed up. I am not fired yet. Her response appeared less than a minute later. The yet is doing too much work in that sentence. Gabe laughed quietly. Then another message arrived. Whatever happens, tell the truth. Do not make yourself smaller, and do not make yourself bigger. That sounded exactly like her. At 7:15, Jonathan entered the break room. Did you sleep at all? About 40 minutes on the bus yesterday. That's not sleep. That's public transportation with your eyes closed. Gabe smiled uncertainly. Jonathan sat across from him. Quality confirmed your diagnosis. The words took a second to land. They did. Yes. The temporary repair will stay isolated until the engineering review. Gabe nodded, relieved. Thank you for telling me. I'm not finished. Of course not. Jonathan folded his hands. At 8:30, 13 of the 15 engineers who resigned are coming back for a meeting. Gabe stared at him. You called them personally? I hired most of them personally at one point or another. Calling seemed reasonable. What do you want me to do? Listen. Gabe almost laughed at the coincidence. Jonathan noticed. Something funny? No, sir. My grandfather would approve. Good. Then both of you can be happy. His expression became serious again. I may ask you questions. Answer only what you witnessed. Do not interpret anyone's intentions. Do not use the meeting to settle a score with Douglas. I won't. I believe you. That's why I'm asking you to be there. Gabe looked through the break room window toward the factory. Mr. Mercer, can I ask something? Yes. Why are you bringing them back if they already resigned? Jonathan leaned back. Because 15 competent people making the same decision on the same night is not an employee problem. It's a system signal. Gabe thought about the CNC. One alarm could mislead you. A pattern told a story. Jonathan seemed to read the thought on his face. Exactly. At 8:22, the first former engineer walked through the main entrance. Marcus came first. Then Leah Benton from Controls, Raj Patel from Systems Integration, Nina Wallace from Process Engineering. One by one, people who had left hours earlier returned without changing their minds about why they had gone. Nobody looked comfortable. Douglas arrived at 8:27. He wore the same white shirt from the previous day, now creased beneath the arms. He walked quickly toward the conference room, saw Gabe standing outside and stopped. His eyes dropped to the intern badge. Why are you here? Before Gabe could answer, Jonathan stepped from the doorway. Because I asked him to be. Douglas's face changed. Jonathan, I didn't know you were coming in. That was the point. Douglas glanced through the glass wall at the returning engineers. I can explain the resignations. Good. In a few minutes, you'll have the chance. His eyes moved back to Gabe. And the machine? Jonathan held Douglas's gaze. Running. For the first time since Gabe had met him, Douglas Crane had no immediate answer. Jonathan opened the conference room door. Inside, 13 engineers sat around the long table, not as employees awaiting instruction, but as people who had already decided they could leave. That difference changed the room before anyone spoke. Jonathan took the seat at the side rather than the head. He left the head chair empty. Then he said, Nobody in this room reports to anybody for the next hour. I want to know how 15 engineers reached the point where resignation felt easier than being heard. Douglas inhaled as if preparing to respond. Jonathan lifted one hand. Not you first. He looked around the table. Them. For the first 30 seconds, nobody said anything. The conference room was designed to make silence uncomfortable. Glass walls looked over the factory floor. A long walnut table reflected the ceiling lights. At one end, a large screen still displayed the Vanguard logo above the words, Precision through Discipline. Jonathan had seen that slogan hundreds of times. That morning, it felt incomplete. Marcus Lee finally spoke. This wasn't about one bad night. Douglas shifted in his chair. Jonathan looked at Marcus. Then start before the bad night. Marcus folded his hands. For about a year, technical reviews have become less like reviews and more like confirmations. We bring data. A direction has already been chosen. If the data supports the direction, we're efficient. If it doesn't, we're told to rerun it. Jonathan turned to Leah Benton. Is that your experience? Yes. Raj Patel nodded. So did 3 others. Douglas leaned forward. Engineering leadership requires decisions. We cannot debate every possibility forever. You'll get your turn, Jonathan said. Douglas leaned back. Nina Wallace spoke next. The problem isn't that decisions get made. The problem is what happens to disagreement. People stop raising concerns if every concern becomes a test of loyalty. Gabe sat near the wall with his notebook closed on his lap. He had expected anger. What he heard instead was fatigue. No shouting, no dramatic accusations, just example after example of people learning that silence was easier. One engineer described concerns repeatedly sent back for more testing. Another said younger staff had begun asking senior colleagues to present their ideas, because titles seemed to matter more than evidence. Jonathan wrote almost nothing. He listened. After 40 minutes, he looked at Douglas. Your turn. Douglas straightened. I won't pretend I'm easy to work for. This division handles components where mistakes can cost us contracts and reputations. I push people because the standard has to be high. Nobody here has complained about high standards, Jonathan said. They're describing the consequences of high-pressure work. Marcus shook his head. No. We're describing what happens when pressure only travels downward. Douglas looked at him. You were team lead. You signed off on the controller diagnosis too. Marcus did not flinch. Yes, and I regret it. Douglas seemed ready for defense, not ownership. Marcus continued. I thought the controller diagnosis was probably right, but by last night I wasn't sure. I signed the first report because everyone was moving in the same direction, and we were exhausted. When you asked us to sign the final report as definitive, I couldn't do it. Jonathan asked, why definitive? Douglas answered immediately. Procurement needed certainty to place the emergency order. Procurement needed an approved technical basis. Certainty is a different thing. Douglas's jaw tightened. Jonathan looked at Gabe. Tell them what you found. Every face turned. Gabe stood slowly. He had once imagined enjoying this moment. Now, revenge felt strangely small. He walked to the whiteboard. I didn't start with the valve, he said. I started with the temperature difference. He drew the secondary coolant loop, marking the supply path, spindle heat exchanger, return line, upstream pressure sensor, and valve location. The alarm pointed to position correction exceeding tolerance. That made the controller look like the source. But the correction increased as spindle temperature increased. So I checked whether the thermal compensation was reacting to a different physical condition. He wrote 2 temperature values from the logs. The return side was consistently hotter than historical baseline. Pressure stayed normal, because the sensor is here before the restriction. Leah leaned forward. So the pump looked healthy. Yes. Current draw was normal too. Raj asked. What created the restriction? Gabe drew the valve cross-section. A 74D insert was installed as an approved substitute 8 months ago. Same external size, same pressure rating, narrower internal passage. Fine metallic residue accumulated until flow became uneven. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. We never checked the part variant. Gabe shook his head. I only checked because I was trying to understand why the failure tracked with temperature. Douglas spoke from the other end of the table. And you opened the machine without authorization. The room became quiet. Gabe looked at him. Yes. Douglas seemed surprised. Who violated procedure? Yes, Gabe continued. I should have had authorization before removing the valve insert. I documented everything, but I still crossed the line. Priya Shah, who had joined the meeting after verification, nodded once. Douglas looked toward Jonathan. Then whatever technical result he produced doesn't excuse that. Correct, Jonathan said. Again, the room shifted. Douglas had expected opposition. Jonathan gave him agreement. But, Jonathan continued, his procedural mistake does not make your technical conclusion correct. We are going to be capable of holding 2 facts at the same time. He stood and walked to the whiteboard. Fact 1. Gabe should not have accessed the machine without authorization. We will address that. Fact 2. Gabe identified a root cause 15 engineers missed because our diagnostic process narrowed too quickly around one interpretation. We will address that too. He circled the cooling loop. Fact 3. 15 engineers resigned because they no longer believed disagreement could survive inside this department. That is the largest failure in this room. Douglas stared at the table. Jonathan turned to the engineers. I am not asking any of you to withdraw your resignations today. Several heads lifted. Promises made before breakfast won't rebuild trust. So here is what I can do. Effective immediately. Engineering operations will report temporarily to Rebecca Collins and Priya Shah, while we conduct an independent review of decision protocols, workload escalation, and technical challenge procedures. Douglas looked up sharply. You're removing me? Temporarily from operational authority. You will participate in the review. Based on one meeting? Based on 15 resignations, a failed diagnostic process, and what I have heard this morning. Douglas pushed his chair back slightly. I have given 21 years to this company. Jonathan's voice remained calm. That is exactly why you deserve a process, not a public judgment, and exactly why the company deserves to examine whether 21 years of authority made some habits invisible to you. Douglas said nothing. Jonathan looked toward Gabe. As for Mr. Mendoza, he is suspended from equipment access until safety and engineering review what he did. Gabe felt his stomach drop, even though he had expected consequences. Then Jonathan added, he will remain employed as an intern during that review. Liza's message echoed in Gabe's mind. Do not make yourself smaller, and do not make yourself bigger. He nodded. The meeting ended without applause. That felt right. As people began to leave, Marcus approached Gabe. You handled that well. I got suspended. From machine access. You're still standing inside the conference room with the founder after telling him you ignored authorization. Trust me, this morning could have gone differently. Gabe smiled faintly. Marcus looked at the cooling diagram. I should have listened when you mentioned temperature. Gabe shook his head. I didn't explain it very well. Maybe, but I heard enough to be curious. He held out his hand. Gabe shook it. Across the room, Douglas stood beside the empty head chair. Gabe felt no triumph. He wondered whether decades of being expected to have answers had made Douglas forget how to ask questions. Jonathan approached Gabe as the room emptied. Go home. Sir, I can still help with documentation. You have been awake almost 24 hours. At this point, the most responsible engineering decision available to you is sleep. Gabe could not argue with that. Jonathan handed him the blue notebook. Tomorrow at 9, my office. Gabe stared at him. Why? Jonathan looked through the glass toward the machine floor. Because fixing the CNC may have been the beginning of your problem, not the end of it. Gabe slept until almost 5 in the afternoon. When he woke, sunlight was pressing through the blinds in thin gold lines. For several seconds he did not know what day it was. Then he saw the blue notebook on his desk and remembered everything at once. The machine. Jonathan Mercer. The conference room. Suspended equipment access. 15 resignations. His phone showed 23 notifications. Most were from classmates who had somehow heard that something unusual had happened at Vanguard. Gabe ignored them. The company had not made any public announcement, and he had no interest in becoming the source of one. In the kitchen, Liza was preparing rice and vegetables before her evening hospital shift. You're alive, she said, barely. Did the billionaire fire you? Not exactly. Gabe told her about the verification, the meeting, and the suspension from equipment access. Liza listened while slicing green onions. How do you feel? I don't know. Try more words. College is expensive. Use them. He smiled. Relieved. Embarrassed. Proud, maybe. Worried that being proud makes me arrogant. That sounds exhausting. It is. Liza placed the knife down. Pride is not arrogance. Arrogance is when pride becomes permission to stop listening. Gabe looked at her. Did Lolo tell you to say that? No. Your grandfather would use 20 more words and compare you to a broken fan belt. They both laughed. Then Liza became serious. What happened to Mr. Crane? Temporary review. He's not running engineering right now. And how do you feel about that? Gabe thought carefully. Yesterday I wanted him to be proven wrong. Today I mostly want the team to work again. Liza nodded. Good. That sounds like sleep helped. The next morning, Gabe arrived at Vanguard at 8:42. His badge opened the main entrance but no longer granted access to controlled equipment areas. The restriction was visible on the small screen when he tapped in. For the first time, he was grateful for it. Consequences made the previous night real. At 9 exactly, he entered Jonathan Mercer's office. The room surprised him. It was large but almost severe. Steel bookshelves, old machine parts mounted like sculptures, technical drawings framed beside company awards. Behind the desk sat a photograph of a much younger Jonathan, standing beside a manual lathe in a cramped industrial unit. Jonathan noticed Gabe looking. 1988, first shop. You really started with 2 machines? 1.5. The mill worked when it felt respected. Gabe smiled. Priya Shah sat near the window with a folder in her lap. Morning, Gabe. Morning. Jonathan pointed to a chair. We reviewed your actions yesterday. Gabe sat straighter. Okay. Priya opened the folder. You violated access policy by servicing the cooling loop without authorization. However, you followed the published isolation procedure, documented each step, used approved measuring tools, and did not release the machine into production. Yes, you also used a component from a decommissioned training rig as part of a temporary configuration. Yes. That was technically sound but still outside your authority. I understand. She closed the folder. Your equipment suspension will remain for 2 weeks. During that time, you'll complete the same lockout, machine safety, and controlled maintenance training required for junior engineering staff. Gabe blinked. Junior engineering staff? Jonathan leaned forward. Your internship assignment is changing. Gabe looked between them. To what? Technical engineering intern. You will still be a student. You will not pretend to be an engineer before you are one. But sorting torque wrenches is no longer the best use of what you can do. Gabe's mouth went dry. Sir, Jonathan held up a hand. There is more. Priya gave him a small smile. Jonathan continued. Vanguard has a tuition support program for employees. It usually begins after 1 year of service. I'm waiving the waiting period. If you maintain satisfactory grades and continue working here, the company will cover your remaining undergraduate tuition at an accredited engineering program. For several seconds, Gabe heard nothing except the ventilation system. His mother worked extra shifts to help with tuition. He had spent evenings calculating whether he could transfer to a 4-year school without borrowing more than they could safely manage. Now the problem seemed to disappear in one sentence. Why? He asked. Jonathan seemed pleased by the question. Because companies spend a lot of money recruiting talent they failed to notice standing inside their own building. I'd rather not repeat the mistake. Gabe looked down at his hands. Thank you. Don't thank me by becoming impossible to manage. A laugh escaped Gabe before he could stop it. Jonathan smiled. There is one condition beyond grades. Gabe waited. You need a mentor. Priya said. Marcus Lee agreed. If he returns. The happiness on Gabe's face faded slightly. If? Jonathan nodded. Of the 15 engineers, only 6 had formally agreed to pause their resignations while the review proceeded. 4 requested more time. 3 had decided to leave regardless. 2 still had not responded. We don't get to demand trust because we finally started listening, Jonathan said. So I have to earn it. That afternoon, the engineering team faced its first test without Douglas in command. The CNC was repaired, but Priya would not release it for production until the temporary cooling configuration had a permanent engineering disposition. A correct 74B valve would take 6 days to arrive from the supplier. 6 days was better than months, but the production schedule was already badly behind. Rebecca called a cross-functional meeting. Gabe attended, seated near the back, unable to touch equipment, but allowed to contribute. For For the first time, nobody asked why an intern was there. Marcus led the technical discussion. "We have 3 options," he said. "Wait for the correct valve, requalify the existing D variant with a redesigned filter arrangement, or fabricate a temporary B equivalent insert internally and validate it." Priya looked around the room. Ideas before preferences. The phrase was intentional. For 20 minutes, people offered concerns without being interrupted. A maintenance technician pointed out that the residue itself needed investigation. A process engineer questioned whether coolant cleanliness had changed. Gabe mentioned that the training rig's compatible spacer showed almost no build-up despite years of use. Marcus did not simply accept the observation. What would prove that matters, Gabe thought. Particle analysis from the current coolant and samples from the return filter. Good, let's get it. No praise. No dismissal. Just the next question. Gabe felt something loosen inside him. By evening, the team discovered a second issue. The coolant filtration interval had been extended during a cost reduction initiative 9 months earlier. The wrong valve had not created the problem alone. The longer service interval increased residue, and the narrower valve passage made the system vulnerable. 2 decisions that seemed harmless separately had combined into one expensive failure. Jonathan listened to the update from the doorway. "So, who made the mistake?" he asked. The room went quiet. Marcus looked at the data. "The system did," Jonathan nodded. "Better answer." Gabe understood what he meant. If they reduced the story to one careless person, they would miss the pattern again. The machine had not failed because of one villain. The team had not failed because of one meeting. And Gabe's future would not be built because of one dramatic night. Everything important was turning out to be a chain. The question was whether Vanguard had finally learned to look at every link. 3 days after the machine returned to diagnostic readiness, the factory sounded different, not quieter. Vanguard was never quiet once day shift began. Forklifts still crossed marked lanes. Cutting tools still sang against metal. Inspection stations still clicked and flashed, but the engineering bay had changed in ways that were harder to measure. Whiteboards now carried a new heading at the top of every failure review. What would disprove our current theory? Priya had introduced it as a temporary practice. By the second day, technicians were using it without being asked. Gabe noticed because he noticed everything. He also noticed the empty desks. Of the 15 engineers who resigned, 8 had returned under temporary agreements while the independent review continued. 3 had confirmed their departures. 2 requested leave before deciding. 2 remained unreachable. Marcus was back, but he had not withdrawn his resignation completely. Trust with an expiration date, he called it. Gabe understood. The permanent 74B valve was still in transit, so the CNC remained unavailable for production. That delay forced the company to reroute part of the work to 2 smaller machines and negotiate a revised delivery sequence with the customer. Jonathan refused to hide the technical delay behind vague language. "We tell them what happened, what we verified, and what we're doing," he told Rebecca. "Confidence built on incomplete information is rented confidence. Eventually the bill arrives. The customer accepted the recovery plan. It did not erase the losses, but it prevented the crisis from becoming larger. Gabe spent his equipment suspension completing training modules and shadowing Marcus. For someone who had desperately wanted permission to touch machines, he discovered that not touching them could be unexpectedly educational. Marcus made him explain every decision before anyone reached for a tool. What's the failure statement? What evidence supports it? What evidence would contradict it? What changed recently? The questions reminded Gabe of Ernesto, but with a different discipline. His grandfather worked from decades of physical intuition. Marcus forced intuition into language other people could test. One afternoon, Gabe said, "Lolo would hate how much paperwork you make me do." Marcus looked offended. "Your grandfather sounds irresponsible. He documents everything. He just complains while doing it." "Then your grandfather is an engineer. He'd argue with you for an hour about that. Definitely an engineer." They were both laughing when Douglas Crane entered the bay. The laughter stopped naturally, not because anyone ordered it to. Douglas had been away from daily operations, while the review team interviewed employees and examined decision records. He looked more rested than he had during the crisis, but less certain of where to put himself. His office remained upstairs. His title remained unchanged pending review, yet his authority had been paused, and everyone knew it. He approached Marcus first. "Can I speak with Gabe?" Marcus looked at Gabe. That small gesture mattered. Permission did not automatically flow from title anymore. Gabe nodded. They moved to a conference alcove beside the engineering bay. Douglas remained standing. "I heard about the tuition program. Congratulations." "Thank you." The words were polite and awkward. Douglas looked through the glass toward cell 7. "I owe you an apology." Gabe said nothing. "I dismissed your observation because I assumed your lack of experience made it unlikely to be useful." That was poor judgment. It was not a dramatic apology. No trembling voice, no grand confession. That made it feel more real. Gabe considered several responses. Finally, he said, "I appreciate you saying that." Douglas nodded, but did not leave. "You're probably wondering whether I mean it because of the review." I wasn't going to ask, but you wondered. Gabe gave a small, honest nod. Douglas looked down at his hands. "I used to be the youngest person in rooms like that. I hated when people ignored me. Then I became the person everyone had to convince. Somewhere in between, I decided speed was the same thing as leadership." Gabe listened. 15 people walking out made that difficult to defend," Douglas continued. 8 came back. "Which means 7 haven't." Gabe had no answer. Douglas looked at him. "You did something technically impressive. You also did something I would have disciplined any engineer for doing without authorization." "I know." "Good. Don't let everyone calling you talented convince you that rules apply only to people with less talent." The warning could have sounded bitter. Instead, it sounded almost protective. Gabe nodded. "I won't." Douglas started to leave, then stopped. "For what it's worth, the temperature comment you made in the meeting was worth investigating. I should have asked you to show the data. For what it's worth, I should have had the data ready before I interrupted." A faint smile appeared on Douglas's face. "Maybe we're both trainable." He walked away. That evening, Gabe called Ernesto from the employee courtyard. His grandfather listened to the entire conversation twice because the first time he became distracted by a customer bringing in a noisy water pump. "So the difficult boss apologized," Ernesto said. "Kind of." "No kind of. Did he say he was wrong?" "Yes." "Then he apologized. Do not demand poetry from a mechanic." Gabe laughed. "He's not a mechanic." "Worse, management." Gabe could hear traffic outside the Olongapo shop. "Lolo, Jonathan offered to pay my tuition." There was silence on the line. For once, Ernesto had no joke ready. "All of it?" "If I keep my grades up." "Then keep your grades up. That's all you have to say? What do you want? Fireworks?" Gabe smiled, but his eyes stung unexpectedly. "Mom won't have to take extra shifts for school anymore." Ernesto's voice softened. "That is good." "I wish you were here." Another pause. "You carry enough of me around already, especially when you argue." Gabe looked at his blue notebook. The next morning, the correct valve arrived earlier than expected. Marcus gathered the engineering, maintenance, and quality teams for installation and validation. Gabe's 2-week equipment suspension still had 9 days remaining. He stood outside the controlled boundary and watched. Part of him wanted badly to be the person installing the component that completed his diagnosis. Marcus seemed to know. "Annoying, isn't it?" "Very." "Good. Consequences should be memorable." The team installed the valve, restored the loop, flushed the coolant, replaced the affected filters, and began the qualification sequence. Temperature stabilized. Flow remained steady. Position compensation stayed well inside tolerance. After 6 hours of testing, Priya approved the machine for a limited production validation run. The first titanium test piece entered the work chamber. Everyone gathered behind the safety line. The spindle accelerated. Coolant flooded the cutting zone. For 22 minutes, the machine moved through the program without a fault. When the door finally opened, Priya carried the finished piece directly to inspection. The dimensional scanner completed its pass. A green report appeared, within specification. Nobody cheered at first. Then one technician clapped once. Someone else joined. Within seconds, the engineering bay filled with applause. Gabe remained near the back. Marcus turned and pointed at him. "Don't hide now." Gabe shook his head, embarrassed, but the team made space. Jonathan stood near the doorway watching them. He did not see one intern being celebrated for defeating 15 engineers. He saw something more useful, a team, learning how to become a team again. His phone vibrated. The independent review firm's preliminary report had arrived. Jonathan opened the first page. The machine problem was solved. The leadership problem was not, and one recommendation on that page would force him to make the hardest decision of the entire crisis. Jonathan read the recommendation twice, then a third time. The applause from the engineering bay was still audible through the glass, but the words on his phone seemed to quiet everything around him. The independent review firm had interviewed 37 employees, examined 2 years of engineering meeting records, compared maintenance decisions with internal escalation logs, and reviewed the circumstances surrounding all 15 resignations. Its preliminary conclusion was direct. The technical failure had exposed a leadership structure in which too many decisions depended on one person being certain, and too many employees had learned that raising an inconvenient question carried more professional risk than staying silent. The recommendation was equally direct. Douglas Crane should not return to management authority over the engineering division. Jonathan slipped the phone into his pocket. Across the bay, Gabe was listening while Marcus explained the next qualification step. Priya stood near the inspection station. 2 technicians were already discussing whether the new coolant monitoring plan needed an additional sensor downstream of the valve. For the first time in days, people were disagreeing openly and calmly. That should have made Jonathan feel relieved. Instead, he felt responsible. Douglas had not appointed himself. Jonathan had promoted him. Years earlier, when Vanguard was growing faster than its systems, Douglas had seemed like exactly the leader the company needed. He made decisions quickly. He remembered details. He demanded preparation. He kept projects moving when everyone else wanted another meeting. Jonathan had rewarded those qualities. Then he had stopped looking closely enough at what they became. At 7 that evening, he asked Douglas to meet him in the small conference room overlooking the port. The sky outside was turning orange, behind rows of cranes and shipping containers. Douglas arrived without a laptop. That alone told Jonathan he understood what the meeting was about. Jonathan placed a printed copy of the preliminary report on the table. Douglas did not reach for it. "They recommend removing me," Jonathan nodded, "from management authority over engineering." Douglas looked through the glass, toward the factory floor. "Do you agree?" Jonathan did not answer immediately. 38 years of running a company had taught him that some decisions became easier when reduced to numbers. This was not one of them. "I agree that the department cannot return to the structure it had before this week." Douglas gave a small nod. "That's not quite the same answer." "No, it isn't." Jonathan sat across from him. "You've done good work here, Douglas. A lot of it. That is part of why this is difficult. People trust strong performers longer than they should sometimes. I did." Douglas finally looked at him. "You think I shouldn't have been in the job? I think you were good at the job we needed 10 years ago. I think the company changed, and the job changed, and neither of us admitted that your way of leading had stopped fitting the team." Douglas lowered his eyes to the report. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Douglas said, "I kept telling myself pressure was temporary. The contract would settle down, the hiring shortage would improve. The next quarter would be easier. So every time someone wanted to slow a decision, I thought they were making the pressure worse. And eventually I stopped hearing the difference between slowing a decision and questioning me." The admission came without self-pity. Jonathan appreciated that. "The report recommends I permanently separate the technical authority role from the people management role," Jonathan said. "I intend to do that." Douglas leaned back. "And me?" Jonathan had considered 3 options before the meeting: a reduced management position, a temporary leave followed by reassignment, or a clean end to Douglas's executive role. Only one felt honest. "I can't put you back over the same people who left because they no longer believed they could speak freely." Douglas absorbed the sentence. I understand. I can offer you a 6-month technical transition assignment. No direct reports. You would document systems knowledge, support the redesign of our engineering review process, and help transfer the programs you know better than almost anyone here. At the end of that period, we decide whether there is a technical role that makes sense for both sides. Douglas looked surprised. Why offer me that? Because accountability and humiliation are not the same thing. Douglas stared at the table. Jonathan continued. You made serious leadership mistakes. You also spent 20 years helping build this company. I am not going to pretend one cancels the other. A long silence followed. Finally, Douglas picked up the report. May I have until morning? Of course. Douglas stood, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, I think separating technical authority from people management is overdue. Jonathan almost smiled. You could have mentioned that earlier. Douglas gave him a tired look. Apparently I was difficult to disagree with. The next morning, Douglas accepted the transition assignment. Jonathan announced the change to the engineering staff himself. He did not blame Douglas for everything that had happened. He did not use phrases like isolated leadership failure or unfortunate communication gap. He said something simpler. The structure failed you. Douglas was responsible for part of that. I was responsible for allowing the structure to continue. We are changing both. No one applauded. Jonathan did not expect them to. Trust was not a speech. It was a pattern people had to watch repeat long enough to believe. After the meeting, Gabe found Jonathan near cell 7. Mr. Mercer? Gabe. Can I ask something? That's becoming a company tradition. Go ahead. Gabe glanced toward the upstairs offices. Did Douglas lose his job because of what happened with me? Jonathan studied the young man. No. Gabe waited. What happened with you made a larger problem impossible to ignore. That's different. He apologized to me. I know. I think he meant it. I think he did too. Gabe seemed relieved but still uncertain. Jonathan rested one hand on the safety rail. People can mean an apology and still need consequences. People can make a poor decision and still have value. Maturity is learning to hold both facts at the same time. Gabe looked at the machine that had started everything. Lolo says a repaired part isn't the same as a new part. Meaning, you don't pretend the crack was never there. You inspect the repair more carefully because you know where it failed before. Jonathan nodded slowly. Your grandfather and I would probably get along. He would argue with you first. Even better. That afternoon, the independent review team sent its second recommendation. Every major technical failure review at Vanguard would now require a written dissent section before a final conclusion could be approved. Someone had to record the strongest alternative explanation. Someone had to state what evidence would prove the preferred theory wrong. And no report could close with a blank dissent section simply because a room agreed quickly. Jonathan approved the change immediately. On the first new form printed for cell 7, Marcus wrote one sentence under alternative explanation. Check what the machine is telling us before deciding what we expect it to say. Gabe read it twice. Then, beneath it, in smaller handwriting, he added another line. And make sure someone else can verify what you heard. The next test was not mechanical. It was whether people who had walked away from Vanguard could believe the company had changed enough to come back. Jonathan refused to delegate that question. Over the following week, he spoke personally with all 15 engineers who had resigned. Some conversations lasted 10 minutes, others lasted more than an hour. He did not begin by asking anyone to return. He began by asking why they had left. Marcus told him that the machine crisis had been the final event, not the first. Priya, who had resigned and returned under a temporary consulting agreement, described years of meetings where younger engineers learned to remove uncertainty from presentations because uncertainty was treated as weakness. Another engineer, Elena Park, remembered proposing a preventive maintenance review after a smaller thermal drift incident 6 months earlier. The suggestion was postponed because the production schedule was already tight. Nobody said my idea was bad, Elena explained. It was worse than that. It disappeared. Jonathan wrote the sentence down. One engineer who had already accepted another job told him he would not return regardless of what changed. "I'm not angry," the man said. "I just need a different chapter." Jonathan thanked him. He meant it. 3 others made the same decision over the next few days. Jonathan did not bargain. If rebuilding trust required people to stay against their better judgment, then nothing had been rebuilt. By Friday, 10 of the 15 had agreed to return permanently or complete a 90-day trial period under the new structure. 5 chose to move on. The number mattered less to Jonathan than he expected. A week earlier, he would have treated 5 departures as a retention failure. Now he understood that sometimes a healthy organization had to respect an honest goodbye. The company held no dramatic welcome-back ceremony. Marcus specifically asked them not to. "I don't want balloons because management stopped making meetings miserable," he told Rebecca. So on Monday morning, 10 engineers simply returned to their desks. Coffee cups reappeared. Monitors came back on. A half-finished model airplane returned to Elena's shelf. Someone replaced the old engineering shift board with a new one. This time, the names were arranged by project rather than rank. Gabe noticed that too. His equipment suspension still had 4 days remaining. He spent them in a training room completing safety certification, machine access protocols, and formal failure analysis coursework. At first, the process felt like punishment dressed as education. Then he began seeing how much he had not known. Lockout boundaries, energy isolation verification, configuration control, temporary repair documentation, tool accountability inside guarded equipment. The night he repaired Cell 7, Gabe had been careful because he respected the machine. Now he understood that professional engineering required respecting the system around the machine too. Marcus made that point without softening it. "You were right about the valve," he said during one training session. "You were wrong about deciding alone that being right gave you permission." Gabe nodded. "I know." "Good. Now explain why." Gabe looked at the lockout diagram on the screen. "Because if someone else had entered the cell without knowing what I was doing, or if the machine configuration had changed while I was testing, my diagnosis could have created a different problem. And because nobody could verify my work until after I finished." Marcus pointed at him. "That's the bigger lesson. Talent that cannot be checked by other people eventually becomes another kind of risk." The words stayed with Gabe. That evening, he repeated them to Liza over dinner. She set down her fork. "I like this, Marcus." "Of course you do. He gives me homework." "Then I like him even more." Mara looked up from her plate. "Are you still famous at work?" "I was never famous." "Mom showed the family group chat the company announcement about your scholarship. Auntie Celia sent it to everyone. You are definitely famous in at least 3 households." Gabe covered his face with one hand. Liza laughed. The scholarship had changed something practical in their home almost immediately. For 2 years, Liza had quietly accepted extra hospital shifts whenever tuition payments approached. Gabe had known, even though she insisted the shifts were unrelated. Now the next semester was covered. Books were covered. Fees were covered. For the first time, the family budget on the refrigerator did not have a question mark beside Gabe's education. He stared at it longer than he expected. Liza noticed. "You did not make me work those shifts," she said. "I know. Do you?" Gabe looked at her. She pointed toward the refrigerator. "A family is not a balance sheet. We carry different things at different times. Still, I wanted to help." "Then help by finishing school." Mara raised her glass of water. "And by becoming rich enough to buy me a car." "You are ruining the moment." "A reliable used car. I'm reasonable." They laughed, and the tension Gabe had carried for months softened into something lighter. The following morning, Jonathan received an email from Douglas. It contained no defense of his previous decisions. Instead, Douglas had attached a 43-page technical transition plan covering the systems for which he held unique historical knowledge. At the end was a short note. "I spent years believing the most useful person in the room was the person with the fastest answer. I intend to spend the next 6 months documenting enough that nobody here ever needs one person to have all the answers again. Jonathan forwarded the note to the review team. He did not send it to the entire company. Some changes deserved to exist before they were advertised. On Gabe's final day of suspension, Marcus found him outside Cell 7. The machine was running a production qualification batch. "Tomorrow," Marcus said, "your access badge changes." Gabe turned. "Technical intern." "Technical engineering intern. Full supervised floor access. You still don't touch anything expensive without authorization." "How expensive is expensive?" "If you have to ask, don't touch it." Gabe smiled. Marcus handed him a small black case. Inside was a calibrated digital temperature probe. Not glamorous, not ceremonial, exactly the kind of tool Gabe loved. A small engraved label had been fixed to the case. "Listen. Measure. Verify." Gabe ran his thumb across the words. "Who did this?" "The team." He looked across the engineering bay. Elena lifted one hand without turning from her monitor. Priya pretended not to notice. 2 technicians grinned. Gabe closed the case carefully. For the first time since entering Vanguard, he did not feel like someone standing just outside the room waiting to be invited in. The invitation had finally come. More importantly, he understood what he was supposed to do with it, not prove that he belonged. Help build a place where the next person would not have to prove it alone. Gabe's first authorized technical assignment arrived on a Wednesday morning, and it was almost disappointingly ordinary. A robotic inspection cell had begun rejecting perfectly good brackets. No production contract was collapsing. No executives were driving to the plant before sunrise. The equipment cost a fraction of Cell 7. Yet Marcus treated the problem with the same seriousness. "Your lead," he told Gabe. Gabe stared at him. "Mine?" "Under supervision. Don't make me regret saying it." The inspection cell used a camera, structured light, and a precision fixture to measure small machined brackets before they moved to final quality review. Every few hours, the system flagged dimensions that later proved acceptable on the independent scanner. A month earlier, Gabe would have approached the machine with his notebook and begun building a private theory. Now he started differently. He gathered the people who knew the cell. Elena from engineering, Rosa Alvarez, the quality technician who ran the independent scanner, Ben Carter from maintenance, and Theo Nguyen, a first-year intern who had joined Vanguard only 4 days earlier. Theo looked confused when Gabe invited him. "I don't know anything about that cell." Gabe remembered exactly how those words felt. "Good," he said. "Then you'll ask questions the rest of us stopped asking." They stood around a whiteboard. At the top, Gabe wrote the new company standard. "What would disprove our current theory?" Then he paused. "Actually, we don't have a theory yet." "What do we know?" Rosa answered first. "The independent scanner says the rejected parts are good." Eleanor added, "The false rejects happen more often after lunch." Ben said, "Camera calibration is current. Fixture was inspected last week." Theo raised a hand halfway, then seemed embarrassed by the gesture. "You don't have to raise your hand," Gabe said. "Right. Sorry. Why after lunch? Is the machine tired?" Ben smiled. Theo immediately looked uncomfortable, but Gabe did not laugh. "Machines don't get tired. What changes after lunch?" The room became quiet. Eleanor looked toward the inspection cell. Sunlight. The cell sat near a high row of west-facing windows. By early afternoon, sunlight crossed the upper portion of the enclosure. Rosa frowned. "The camera has controlled lighting inside." "Then sunlight shouldn't matter," Gabe said. "Let's test whether it does." They did not dismantle anything. They did not replace a sensor. They ran 10 known good parts in the morning lighting condition. All 10 passed. Then Ben positioned a portable work lamp outside the enclosure to mimic the afternoon angle without interfering with safety systems. 3 of 10 parts failed. Gabe felt the familiar surge of excitement that came when a pattern appeared. He almost announced the answer. Then he stopped himself. What would disprove that? "External light is the cause?" Rosa crossed her arms. "Block the light and repeat the test." They did. All 10 passed. Eleanor examined the camera housing and discovered that a thin rubber seal around one access panel had compressed with age, allowing a narrow line of external light to reach the optical area at a specific angle. The camera itself was fine. The software was fine. The fixture was fine. A cheap seal was creating an expensive measurement problem. Theo stared at it. So my machine is tired question wasn't completely useless. It was technically terrible, Ben said. Theo's face fell. Ben continued, but it pointed us toward what changes with time of day. That's useful. Gabe smiled. They replaced the seal, repeated the test under several lighting conditions, and documented the result. The cell passed every run. Marcus reviewed the report that afternoon. Good work. Gabe waited. Marcus looked up. You're expecting criticism. A little. Fine. Your initial test matrix should have included fixture temperature. I knew it, but you did something better than the Cell 7 night. Gabe closed the report. I asked permission? That too. You let another person change your thinking before you became attached to being right. Gabe looked through the glass at Theo, helping Rosa clean the inspection fixture. He asked one weird question. Most useful questions sound weird right before they become obvious. The lesson followed Gabe into the next weeks. His classes resumed in September. 3 mornings a week he attended lectures before taking the train and bus to Vanguard. 2 evenings a week he stayed on campus for lab. His life became a careful arrangement of textbooks, work boots, packed meals, and alarms set earlier than anyone in the apartment appreciated. Liza complained that he was turning the kitchen table into an engineering department. Mara complained that his thermodynamics notes were blocking the television remote. Gabe complained that nobody respected science. It felt normal, that normality mattered. The night at Cell 7 gradually stopped feeling like the single event around which his future turned. It became one story among many. A pump issue, a fixture improvement, a class project, a difficult exam, a successful presentation, a mistake in a calculation that Elena caught before he submitted it. Each experience made him slightly less interested in being the young man who had once outsmarted an entire room and more interested in becoming the engineer who made the room smarter. Jonathan noticed the change from a distance. One afternoon, he found Gabe and Theo beside a maintenance cart. Theo was explaining a theory about an intermittent conveyor sensor. His explanation was messy. Gabe did not interrupt. When Theo finished, Gabe asked, "What evidence would make you abandon that idea?" Jonathan kept walking. He did not need to join the conversation. That evening he called Rebecca into his office. "Add something to the internship redesign." "What?" "Every intern gets a technical mentor, but every intern also gets invited to one real failure review during the first month. No standing in the back with paperwork. They participate." Rebecca smiled. "Because of Gabe?" Jonathan looked toward the factory floor. "Because of whoever comes after Gabe." At nearly the same moment, Gabe received a video call from the Philippines. Ernesto's face appeared too close to the camera. "Lolo, move the phone away. I can see one eyebrow. The phone is badly designed. Your hand is covering the camera, also badly designed." Eventually the image settled. Gabe told him about the inspection cell. Ernesto listened, then asked, "Who found the light?" Theo asked what changed after lunch. Elena said sunlight. Rosa designed the confirmation test. Ben found the replacement seal. Ernesto smiled. "And you?" Gabe thought about it. "I kept everyone in the room long enough to find it." His grandfather's smile widened. "Ah, what? You are learning the harder repair." "Which one?" "People working together. Machines are easier," Gabe laughed. But after the call ended, he wrote the sentence in his blue notebook, not because it described a machine, because for the first time, the notebook had become about more than machines. By December, the blue notebook was almost full. Its early pages were crowded with diagrams of coolant loops, spindle assemblies, valves, and sensors. The later pages looked different. There were still technical sketches, but now Gabe also wrote questions. Who else has seen this? What changed? What evidence would prove me wrong? Who needs to verify this before we act? On the inside back cover, He had written one final line in Tagalog after a late-night conversation with Ernesto. Makinig bago magsalita. Listen before speaking. The semester ended on a rainy Thursday. Gabe finished his last exam at noon and arrived home expecting a quiet dinner. Instead, he opened the apartment door and found 6 relatives on a video call displayed across the television, Mara holding a homemade sign that read, "Engineer in Progress," and Liza carrying a grocery store cake with his name spelled slightly wrong. "Mom, do not complain. The bakery was busy. It says Gable. Tonight you are Gable." Everyone laughed. The celebration was not for graduation. That was still years away. It was for something smaller, and to Liza just as meaningful. Gabe had completed his first semester under the Vanguard Scholarship with strong grades while keeping his technical internship. No extra hospital shifts had been needed for tuition. No late-night conversations had been spent calculating which bill could wait. When the family call ended, Liza handed Gabe an envelope. Inside was the first internship paycheck stub she had saved from the summer. He looked at her. "Why did you keep this?" "Because you came home that day and told me you spent 8 hours labeling drawers, and you were happier than I had seen you in months." Gabe smiled. "I like organized drawers." "I know. It is concerning." She sat beside him. "I kept it because you thought getting through the door was the achievement." Gabe looked at the paper again. "It wasn't? It was one achievement. Staying yourself after people begin noticing you is another." The words landed quietly. At Vanguard, people knew Gabe now. Technicians waved when he crossed the floor. Engineers asked for his observations. New interns had heard the story of Cell 7 before meeting him. That last part made him uncomfortable. The story became cleaner every time someone retold it. In the simplified version, 15 engineers gave up. Gabe walked in, touched the machine, found the problem, and saved the day. The real version was messier. The engineers had not been foolish. They had followed evidence that seemed reasonable inside a culture that discouraged alternatives. Gabe had not solved the problem by instinct alone. He had studied logs, maintenance records, specifications, and temperature patterns. His unauthorized repair had worked, but it had also violated rules he later understood existed for good reasons, and the machine had not been the hardest thing to repair. The team had been. So when Vanguard's communications department asked Gabe to speak at the January intern orientation, he agreed on one condition. "I don't want the speech to be about how I proved everyone wrong." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "What do you want it to be about?" How many people had to be right after that night for the fix to actually matter? The orientation took place in a training auditorium with 42 students from colleges across Southern California. Gabe stood at the front wearing the same gray intern color he had worn during his first summer, though his badge now read Technical Engineering Intern. He told them about Cell 7. He told them he noticed the thermal pattern. He told them he repaired the valve without authorization. That detail surprised some people. "The company rewarded you for that?" one student asked. "The company suspended my equipment access for 2 weeks. Several students laughed uncertainly. Gabe smiled. And they were right to. He explained why. Then he told them about Theo's question regarding the inspection. "Cell, you do not need to be the person with the answer to be useful," Gabe said. "Sometimes you are the person who notices something. Sometimes you ask the question. Sometimes you verify. Sometimes you stop someone from moving too fast." From the back row, Jonathan listened without being announced. Gabe continued. "The best thing that happened to me here was not being right once. It was learning that being right is not the same thing as being complete." Jonathan folded his arms and smiled. After the session, he met Gabe outside the auditorium. "You left out the part where the billionaire was extremely handsome at 4 in the morning. Gabe stared at him. "Sir, I was trying to keep the story realistic." Jonathan laughed loudly enough that 2 interns turned around. "Careful. Full scholarship does not mean full immunity." They walked toward the production floor. Cell 7 was running behind the glass, cutting another titanium component under stable thermal conditions. A permanent downstream flow sensor had been installed months earlier. The maintenance interval had been restored. The 74B replacement part was now controlled in the inventory system. so that the 74D could never be substituted without engineering approval. A small problem had changed a large system. Jonathan stopped beside the observation window. Douglas finishes his transition assignment next month. Gabe looked at him. Is he staying? No. He decided he wants to teach manufacturing systems at a technical college. Gabe was surprised. Really? Apparently he discovered he likes explaining things better when nobody reports to him. Gabe smiled. He'll be good at it. I think so too. Jonathan glanced at Gabe's notebook. Still writing everything down? Almost out of pages. Then buy another one. Lolo already mailed one. Of course he did. The package arrived 2 days later. Inside was a new blue notebook almost identical to the old one. On the first page, Ernesto had written a message in careful English. A good mechanic listens to the machine. A good engineer measures what he hears. A good leader makes room for other people to hear something different. Gabe read it at the kitchen table while Liza prepared dinner. He did not say anything for a while. Then he placed the old notebook beside the new one. One was stained from the night he tried to prove he could solve a problem alone. The other was empty. For the first time, an empty notebook did not feel like a place where Gabe needed to prove what he knew. It felt like space for everything he still had to learn. He opened to the next page and wrote the date, then stopped. There was no urgent fault to diagnose and no one to impress. He simply wrote one question for the person he hoped to become. What will you notice when you are no longer trying to be noticed? Almost 1 year after Jonathan Mercer walked into Vanguard Aeronautics at 4 a.m. and found a Filipino intern beside a machine everyone believed was finished, he came to the factory early again. Some habits never left him. At 4:06 a.m., the security guard waved him through. Jonathan carried the same kind of paper coffee cup. The production bay glowed beneath the same white lights. The night shift moved quietly between stations. Cell 7 was running. This time, the sound did not surprise him. The machine had completed thousands of production cycles since the cooling failure. Its temperature monitoring system now tracked both pressure and flow. The maintenance dashboard showed no unresolved thermal warnings. Every major repair included an alternative theory review before closure. The machine was no longer famous inside Vanguard because it worked. That was the goal. Jonathan continued toward the engineering bay and heard voices near a smaller machining center. He slowed. 3 people stood beside the safety line. One was Gabe. He was 21 now, a little more confident in the way he carried himself, though he still kept the blue notebook tucked into the same pocket. Beside him stood Theo, and a new summer intern named Hannah Brooks. Hannah was explaining something with both hands. The alarm says the tool setter is inconsistent, but the setter passed calibration yesterday, Theo said. So either calibration is wrong, or something changes during the cycle. Gabe nodded. Good. What would disprove each idea? Hannah thought about it. Jonathan stayed out of sight. A year earlier, Gabe would have been alone at that hour, opening a panel nobody authorized him to touch. Now he was supervising a documented diagnostic exercise approved by night maintenance, with the machine safely isolated and 3 names recorded on the work order. The difference made Jonathan smile. Hannah noticed a vibration mark near the fixture base. Theo suggested checking whether the vibration appeared only at certain spindle speeds. Gabe listened. He did not give them the answer. Jonathan realized he probably did not know it yet. That was even better. He walked on before they saw him. The engineering division itself changed slowly enough that people trusted the change. Technical experts could advance without becoming managers. Managers were evaluated partly on whether employees raised concerns early, not merely whether projects stayed on schedule. Failure reviews included technicians, quality staff, and, when appropriate, interns. The dissent section that once seemed strange became routine. Sometimes it remained only 1 sentence. Sometimes it redirected an entire investigation. Jonathan considered that one of the best changes Vanguard had made in years. Gabe changed too. He completed another year of engineering school with Vanguard paying tuition, books, and required fees. He continued working part-time during the semester and full-time during breaks. Liza reduced the extra shifts she had once taken to cover tuition. Mara still demanded a car. Gabe still refused. Ernesto remained in Olongapo, repairing generators, pumps, and anything else neighbors carried into his shop. Every Sunday, Gabe called him. Some conversations lasted 5 minutes, others lasted an hour. They argued about tools, tolerances, repair methods, and whether modern machines had become unnecessarily complicated. Ernesto always won the last argument by pretending the video connection had failed. One Friday afternoon, Vanguard installed a new plaque outside the engineering training room. It did not mention Gabe. He had asked that it not. It carried one sentence. The best idea in the room does not have to come from the highest title. Below it, in smaller letters, listen, measure, verify, share. Jonathan found Gabe reading the plaque after work. You approve? Jonathan asked. Mostly. Lolo says 4 words is too many. What would he use? Listen first. Jonathan nodded. Hard to argue with that. He would still try. They stood for a moment watching employees leave the building. Jonathan had once thought the story of Cell 7 was about a brilliant young intern seeing something experienced engineers missed. That version was dramatic. It was also incomplete. The real story was about what happened after someone noticed the overlooked thing. Would the person speak? Would anyone listen? Would evidence matter more than title? Would being wrong become a reason to hide or a reason to learn? Would being right become a source of arrogance or responsibility? Those questions mattered far beyond one factory. Gabe looked towards Cell 7. Mr. Mercer. Yes? Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't come in that morning? Jonathan considered it. Sometimes. I probably would have been fired. Possibly. That's comforting. Jonathan smiled. Do you know what I think matters more? Gabe waited. What would have happened if you had never said anything in the first place? Gabe's expression changed. Jonathan continued. The machine would eventually have been repaired, maybe after weeks, maybe after replacing expensive parts we didn't need. Companies survive expensive mistakes. What worries me is how long we might have continued believing silence was efficiency. Gabe looked down at his hands. They were cleaner than they had been that first morning, but the fingertips still carried the faint marks of someone who worked with tools. Lolo would say the machine complained loudly enough for somebody to notice eventually. And the people? Gabe looked toward the engineering floor. People usually complain more quietly. Jonathan nodded. That was the lesson he wanted Vanguard to remember. Not that one intern was smarter than 15 engineers, not that a billionaire had arrived at exactly the right moment, not even that a $2 million machine had been saved by someone everyone underestimated. The lesson was simpler. Ability can exist before permission. Wisdom can come from experience, education, observation, or a question nobody else thought to ask. And the strongest teams are not the ones where nobody is wrong. They are the ones where people can be wrong without becoming silent, and right without becoming arrogant. That evening, Gabe returned home, carrying 2 notebooks. The old one was nearly full, its cover worn from the night everything changed. The new one still had hundreds of empty pages. He sat at the kitchen table while Liza prepared dinner, and Mara argued with someone on the phone about a school project. For a moment, Gabe listened to the ordinary sounds of home. Then he opened the new notebook. On the first unused page, beneath Ernesto's message, he wrote the date. He thought about the machine. He thought about the 15 engineers who had walked away. He thought about the 10 who returned, the 5 who chose new paths. Douglas finding a different way to use what he knew. Jonathan learning that ownership did not mean seeing everything, and himself learning that talent mattered most when it made room for other people. Then Gabe wrote one sentence. You do not have to know everything to make a difference. You have to notice, have the courage to speak and the humility to listen when someone else notices what you missed. He closed the notebook when Liza called everyone to dinner. Tomorrow there would be another class, another shift, another machine, another problem nobody fully understood yet. Gabe no longer needed those problems to prove who he was. He simply wanted to help solve them. And sometimes That quiet change inside a person is the most important repair of all.